In most cases, the experience of being aware is mixed up with what we are aware of. In other words, the experience of being aware is mixed up with our thoughts, feelings, activities, relationships, etc. And so most people experience themselves as a mixture of awareness plus thoughts, images, feelings, etc. And this mixture of awareness plus the objects of experience produces the separate self, the finite, temporary self that most people believe and feel themselves to be. So the first thing we do here is extricate what we essentially are from everything that is superfluous to us. We recognize I am simply the experience of being aware, irrespective of what I am aware of. And although what I am aware of continuously changes, what I am, the experience of simply being aware, always remains the same. It is never changed by experience. It is never tarnished by experience. It is never aged by experience. It is never hurt by experience. At the same time, it is intimately one with all experience. We don't have to become that. We cannot become what we already are. We simply have to recognize that and take our stand as that. We simply have to be that knowingly. Everybody is already that, but most people unknowingly so. Having noticed, I am that to which all experience appears, or I am that which knows all experience. The next step is to notice that experience doesn't just appear to me, it appears within me, not within me the body, but within me the presence of awareness, or within me consciousness. I use the words consciousness and awareness synonymously. Is anybody here currently having an experience that is taking place outside consciousness? Has anybody here ever had an experience that took place outside consciousness? Could any of us ever have an experience that took place outside consciousness? Could anybody or anything, could any animal or person ever have an experience that took place outside consciousness? It's not possible to have an experience that takes place outside consciousness, because consciousness is the medium or the field or the space or the presence within which all experience appears. Anything that appears must appear in something or on something. You cannot have a cloud without a sky. You cannot have a wave without an ocean. You cannot have an email without a screen. Consciousness is the medium within which all experience arises. So although in our culture we believe that consciousness exists inside the brain, which exists inside the body, which exists inside the world, which exists inside the universe, our actual experience is the opposite of that. The body and the world and the universe are experienced as a flow of sensations and perceptions. Has anyone here ever had an experience of the body or the world that was not either a sensation or a perception? And has anyone here ever had the experience of a sensation or a perception that did not appear in consciousness? You see, we have no knowledge or experience of a world outside consciousness. And yet, strangely, our entire world culture is founded on the belief that consciousness appears in and is a byproduct of the world or the body. So here we just stick strictly to the evidence of our experience. Thoughts, images, feelings, sensations, perceptions, that is the mind, the body and the world, they all appear in consciousness, and we are that consciousness.
Okay, last time you helped me push through a wall of understanding. I'm still grappling with getting my mind to catch up with where my intuition is. I appreciate your reminder about the discrepancy and how intolerable it's getting. You've referred to Bernardo Kastrup a number of times, and I appreciate that reference because he's been very helpful to me in helping me surface my materialist conditioning. And I'm in my third reading of Brief Peaks Beyond, and it's wonderfully upsetting. He does a marvelous job of explicitly articulating the materialist worldview and then rebutting it. After my conversation with you last time, I had the opportunity to go on a hike, and I was looking at this beautiful vista, and you'd encouraged us to work with our perception of beauty as one way to come to that realization. And as I was looking at this magnificent landscape overlooking the Hudson, the three words popped into my mind: it's all inside. And at one level I get that. Everything I see, it's all stuff that I know, that is known by here. Everything, especially in sight, in the visual world, which is the most challenging for me. And I still seem to be stuck on the idea that, okay, even though it's all known by me here in this presence, this active awareness presence, there's still an external material universe out there. Okay.
But Bernardo is saying that the real abstract realm, the real metaphysical ontology is materialism, because unlike the spiritual approaches which talk about only about realms of experience, the materialist paradigm speaks about a world that exists outside of experience. In that sense, it is metaphysical, way more metaphysical than the so-called metaphysical paradigms, which only speak of realms of experience, albeit realms of experience that are not limited to the waking state. But the metaphysical realms don't speak of realms that are inherently beyond our experience, beyond our possibility to know them. They describe experiences that are knowable, albeit through training, meditation, etc. Whereas the materialistic paradigm is the truly quote unquote metaphysical paradigm in the sense of being abstract and lofty, indeed so abstract and lofty that we could never come in contact with the material world that the materialist paradigm proposes, because all we could ever come in contact with is our experience within consciousness. So it is materialism that proposes that there is a world outside experience, that is outside consciousness, which is by definition forever unknowable. For that is metaphysical, that is abstract, that is convoluted. Because such a world by definition could never be verified. Because anything that is verified would be by definition within our experience and therefore within consciousness. So Bernardo is saying that he's not denying that this is real. I don't deny that this is real. This is absolutely real. As we've said many times this week, all experience is real. This is absolutely real. It's just not what it appears to be. It appears from the perspective of a separate subject of experience to be a separate object of experience made out of something other than ourselves, i.e. matter. But actually our only knowledge of it is within consciousness. You know, everything that appears within consciousness is made of consciousness. Now the stuff that everything in consciousness is made of is called mind. Mind and consciousness in this conversation are synonymous. Mind is the activity of consciousness. So Bernardo is saying, and I agree with him, that all of this is absolutely real. This isn't just a fake image that our brains are recreating of a universe which we can never know. This is the real universe. This is God's face. However, this is not appearing outside consciousness. This is absolutely real. But its reality, if we go deeply into it, is consciousness. That's all, is the knowing of it. That's all that this is made of.
And when all of us leave the room, that table is still there.
No, I'm afraid this table isn't here in the way you think it is here when we're in the room, let alone when we're out of the room. Remember Balayani, the knowledge of God does not require the passing away of existence, or the passing away of that passing away, because things have no existence. There are no real things as things in their own right. So even while you are experiencing this table, it is not a thing in its own right.
Got it conceptually.
No, you get it experientially. What knowledge of anything do you have apart from the knowing of it? What you get conceptually is that this is an object made out of matter. That you get conceptually. What you get experientially is that all you know is the knowing of your experience.
Yes, I agree and completely. What is surfacing for me is the very deep materialist conditioning that is a separate object that has its own independent existence apart from my consciousness.
No, not apart from your consciousness, apart from consciousness.
Okay, that may be the distinction.
This is not solipsism.
Right.
I'm not, just remind me your name.
Olas.
Olas. I'm not suggesting, and Bernardo is not suggesting, the non-dual teaching does not suggest that all there is the content of our own individual finite mind. Consciousness is much bigger than the finite mind. Our finite minds are just... Imagine consciousness. Think of consciousness as a great open space. And imagine now that consciousness begins to vibrate within itself, and it doesn't appear in clearly defined forms, but it is vibrating within itself. And at a certain at a certain point, one of these vibrations is of a sufficient, is of a sufficient amplitude and frequency to coalesce into a point of view. So this coalescence of consciousness, this limitation or localization of consciousness, then becomes the point from which infinite consciousness sees the unlocalized part of itself as the world. So each of us are localizations of consciousness through which infinite mind becomes a finite mind. But everything that is not localized consciousness, that's all of this, is known from the point of view of this finite mind as the world. So this is outside our finite mind. That's why when you leave the room, it doesn't disappear. But still, it can still be within consciousness.
I see my conditioning struggling for a shift in perception. You've pointed out to me that it's not a shift.
It's not a shift in perception.
It's a change in understanding.
It's a shift of understanding, yes.
Right.
Perception, the illusion remains, ignorance goes.
Right. But it feels like there has to be some kind of snap or just to get that new understanding or that broader understanding. I think part of the resistance of the mind here is that I really value science because it's so good at dealing with bullshit, and there's a whole lot of bullshit out there.
No, but I think you're being too harsh on science. Science cannot just be written off as bullshit. Look at what science has given us. So science is not bullshit.
Yeah, yes.
But there's a difference between the practical application of science and the interpretation of science. Materialism is the materialist paradigm is an interpretation of a fact. Let's say our world culture was to move from a materialist paradigm to an idealist or a non-dualist paradigm. Many of the all the laws of physics as they are known would remain in operation. They wouldn't all cease to exist. They would continue to operate, but they would now be interpreted not as laws that govern the way physical matter operates, but rather laws that govern the way mind unfolds in consciousness, or laws that govern the activity of consciousness. And the activity of consciousness does take place according to certain habits or patterns. So what used to be laws of physics would now be considered laws of mind. But they would still, same fact, that this still falls, gravity still operates, but it would be given an idealist rather than a realist. Say that the materialist model works at a certain level, a certain practical level, and is valid at that level. It shouldn't be trashed. It's incredible what materialist science has done, but there would be a larger interpretation that would place it in an idealist or consciousness-only framework. And because the consciousness-only model is larger than the materialist model, it can explain many of the phenomena that the materialist model cannot explain. That's one reason why it's preferable. The second reason why it's preferable is that, going back to the beginning of our conversation, the materialist model makes reference to this world outside consciousness, which it believes gives rise to consciousness,
right,
which nobody has ever seen or could ever seen. So right at the heart of the materialist model, there is this real problem.
Yes.
What is the real world? After all, don't forget, this is just a picture that our brains, this is not the real world, this is just a picture that our brains have created. It might have nothing to do with the real world at all. So, what is the real world? No scientist has ever or could ever see it or find it, and yet that is considered to be real. So what we consider to be real is the only thing that is never experienced, and the only thing that is ever experienced, conscious experience, is considered to be unreal or a kind of fake picture in the brain of the true reality which nobody has ever contacted. And that is convoluted. Surely, the consciousness-only model doesn't make reference to anything outside our experience. It doesn't have to invent a substance called matter outside of consciousness in order to explain what takes place within consciousness. The consciousness-only model only refers to what is already experienced, conscious experience, in order to explain what is experienced. And so it doesn't make the assumptions that the materialist model, the material model makes this massive assumption that the real world is forever beyond our reach. The consciousness-only model does make one assumption, and that is that there is more than one finite mind.
Yes.
That is an assumption. That's something that we cannot check. I cannot know from my own experience that each of you are now having your own experiences. I can hit you, and I'll get a response, but I cannot, if we're being really thorough, I cannot know that response is because you have actually felt the pain.
Right, because
it may be you may be in the dark. Your experience may be in the dark, but you may be just having a physical response that is not accompanied by inner experience. So that is solipsism, just to finish, that is an assumption which the consciousness-only model, apart from the fundamentalist. One good question will be, well, why is it legitimate to make that assumption? The assumption that there are other minds, when you deny the validity in making an assumption that there is a world outside experience? Are you not just choosing between the assumptions, choosing the assumption that fits your model? Well, no, not quite. Because in assuming that there are other finite minds, all I am doing is suggesting that there are more examples or more instances of something that I already know, my own mind. So it's only a small step for me to say, well, if my own mind exists, that is something that is actually experienced. And therefore it's not unreasonable, given the fact that my own mind is limited, to suggest that there may be other minds like my mind. I'm not inventing a new substance, I'm not inventing anything outside of experience, I'm just saying there may be more minds like my own. It's a small assumption, and it doesn't make reference to anything that I don't already know. Whereas the assumption of an outside world not only makes reference to to something that I cannot check in my own experience, it also invents a material, something outside consciousness, that something outside called consciousness is called matter, that I have absolutely no experience of. So they are both assumptions, but the materialist assumption is of a different order of magnitude, and is not, I would say, is not reasonable. Whereas the assumption we make that there are other finite minds is reasonable, because it's just suggesting that there are more instances of what I already know and experience for myself.
And that assumption is certainly more acceptable than the idea that matter could generate consciousness.
Well, that is...
that's a huge...
Well, for one, the scientists who believe that they are looking at matter when they look into the brain have still, even if that were the case, even if the brain were made out of something called dead inert matter, they still haven't any idea at all about how matter generates mind. What the materialists claim is that something that nobody has ever seen, something that nobody has ever contacted, gives rise to all we ever know, which is conscious experience. And that is a leap of faith.
Yeah.
I mean, that is akin to, it's like religious belief. It's a religion. I mean, isn't that what religious people believe, that there is a God outside this world that we cannot contact, that we can never know, that created this world? Well, what's the difference between those two paradigms? They're remarkably similar. They both make reference to something outside experience that we have never experienced nor could ever experience, that is considered to give rise to everything we do experience. What's the difference? Materialism is a religion.
Yes,
These hard-headed, hardcore materialist scientists, that they hate religions because they think this appeal to a creator God is so irrational, so far from their experience.
Right.
But their own view is almost identical. They are equally irrational and equally far removed from the truth of their experience.
Thank you for the help in deprogramming.
But these are the rational ways to excavate our deep belief in materialism. But there are other ways. As you know, I feel that the experience of beauty is an intervention from reality into our dualistic and apparently materialistic way of seeing things. So the experience of beauty in relation to objects and love in relation to people are interventions. These are the non-rational ways of arriving at the same conclusion. Of course, they cannot stand up to... Nobody could stand up in front of a materialist scientist and argue that beauty is the evidence that there is nothing outside consciousness. But I think beauty is the evidence. I think love is the evidence that consciousness is shared and universal. I think beauty, the experience of beauty, is the evidence that the world we see is made out of the stuff that we are made out of, consciousness. Of course, that doesn't hold water when talking to a rational scientist. That's why Bernardo has to write books like this, because his audience are mainly irrational, rational scientists. But my audience is more open-minded, more in touch with experience. So here, we are open to the possibility that the experience of beauty, the experiences of beauty and the experiences of love are interventions of reality into our dualistic way of seeing things. They are non-rational evidence of the impersonality and the universality, the consciousness nature of everything.